And if the confirmation had been a little late, could we have had a problem?
We might have had.
Okay, good. Let's talk a little bit about Russia today. That was in the 1970s.
Yeah, late 1970s.
And we learned this week from President Medvedev that this is no longer the 1970s, as he admonished Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney, because of what Mitt Romney said earlier in the week, said that Russia is America's #1 geopolitical foe. Do you believe that Russia is America's #1 geopolitical foe?
Well, first of all, I'm impressed that Governor Romney, particularly given his other foreign policy statements, actually is familiar with the word geopolitical. You know.
How do you really feel?
But no, of course it isn't. Today, our relationship with Russia is mixed. There are some elements of residual antagonism, clearly. There are some conflicting geopolitical interests. There are some overriding shared interests. And there is also some degree of indifference in the sense that we certainly are thinking much more about other parts of the world, either those in which we are still militarily engaged and we would like to disengage, or those which we realize might become more of a competitor to us in the future, and with whom we have the task of structuring an intelligent, mutually responsible, long-term relationship. So Russia, in fact, doesn't loom that high anymore. And I think that is one of the things that some Russians, particularly Putin, I think, resent. Because Putin is still, in my view, motivated by nostalgia for the past. I mean, it's not an accident, he said, that the greatest calamity of the 20th century, a century of World War I, World War II, of the entire Cold War, and earlier of the Holocaust, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest calamity. And he wants to create, he said so, a new Eurasian Union in which the newly independent post-Soviet republics would be part of that union. So he does have a nostalgia for the past. And I think that probably will make for a more difficult relationship, at least initially. But underneath the surface, it is also a fact that Russia is changing significantly, and particularly the large city middle class, large city-based middle class, younger, much more cosmopolitan, is really becoming something similar to the civic society that mushroomed in Central Europe 30 years ago and led to the collapse of communism in Central Europe and eventually to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. That is to say, a middle class that really wants to be part of the world, that travels abroad, studies abroad, and is beginning to understand what civic rights really mean. And that in itself is unprecedented in Russian history, not just Soviet, but Russian. And one more thing, which is really unprecedented. You sense on that level the absence of political fear. They're not afraid. They're not afraid. I mean, they are willing to stand up in the middle of the Red Square with a big placard showing Putin behind bars and saying that's where he ought to be. I mean, to me, who grew up with Hitlerism and then Stalinism as the main preoccupation, the notion that you can do this to the leader in the Kremlin is almost hard to imagine. That shows that fear is absent. And that's a decisive change. So I think Putin will either be an epi-phenomenon briefly for a few years, and then things will begin to move more rapidly, or he may even have to change course at some point.
If there's a thesis that I found in this book, it was that you argue that the most effective way to promote security and stability in the world, I think you used the year 2025, beyond 2025, is to effectively enlarge the West to include Russia and Turkey. Mm-hmm. How does the United States or does an American president do that, particularly with Russia?
Well, that's one half of the sort of main strategic vision. The other half pertains to the Far East. We can talk about that if you wish later. And let me also say that when I use the term strategic vision, as it applies, for example, in this case to the one that you raised, Russia and Turkey, or the other one that we might talk about, China, when I say vision, I don't mean a blueprint. And therefore, in the book, there is no blueprint. But it is my conviction, in any case, that large historical changes are shaped by people that have a strategic vision, which they develop to sufficiently compelling degree that it begins to be important to develop a blueprint for its attainment, and you then move events in that direction. I think Russia can change. I've already indicated why. I think there's already some change taking place. And Russia ultimately is, culturally, a part of the West. If you look at the music, the poetry, the literature, the art, and so forth, it is the West. The only dimension in which it has not been part of the West and is not part of the West yet is in the political field, political values field. It has been kind of quasi-Oriental. But I think the pull, the magnetic pull is there. Well, if it were to be part of the West increasingly, the West would certainly be revitalized to a great extent. There would be a larger sense of dimensions. There would be a sense of new adventure and so forth. And much the same applies in different ways to Turkey. Turkey has been pursuing a remarkably ambitious and by and large, though not entirely, successful program of Europeanization and modernization for almost 100 years, 90 years, ever since the days of Ataturk. Modeled on Germany specifically as a modern society in terms of its social, political, educational arrangements. It's getting there. I think each one of them would contribute to a West defined in terms of shared political values, constitutionalism, democracy, the rule of law, and so forth, would contribute new vitality and eliminate serious potential threats. Russia, Eurasian Union against ambitious, trying to undo us because of the resentments that they lost an empire, or Turkey repelled by the West, alienated, resentful, Islamist, becoming part of that part of the world, which is very, very volatile. So we have a really strategic interest in division becoming the beacon, then implemented with a blueprint and with popular understanding of the historical mission. You know, Europe wouldn't have come into being if people hadn't talked about the need of a united Europe 60, 80 years ago already. They had division. So this is one half, so to speak, of the main message of this book.
Put aside the domestic political consequences of having an open microphone and a president of the United States who seems to say something positive to the president of Russia. But the president had a policy message behind his statement that after the election we'll have some, perhaps some flexibility on the issue of missile defense. From a policy perspective, is that a good idea? Is that the right answer? Should the United States be flexible on that issue?
Okay, it certainly is not the right answer to be discussing it in that fashion in an open mic.
Right.
Look, I think one can make a plausible case that a defense shield directed specifically at Iran to protect Western Europe, to protect all of Europe and ourselves from non-existent Iranian missiles may not be the most urgent thing on our security agenda. Yeah, I can think of a lot of others that are probably more significant. But I think one major merits of this initiative is that it creates one more and, in the longer run, potentially timely security link between the United States and all of Europe. Because we're taking our troops out of Europe. We have really now down to such low levels that we have basically, I believe, we're planning to have 2, at most 3 brigades, and rather somewhat constricted brigades in Europe. The security link between us and Europe is very important for European security, but also for our security. So this creates one more sort of joint project. And I think we should be able to convince the Russians this is not directed against them. I think they're really objecting to it, not because they seriously think it's directed against them, because from what I know of the systems, they're just not particularly good against ICBMs, and particularly the kind of things that the Russians have. I think what they object to the most is the idea that this deployment will create one more security link between us and Europe, and particularly between us and Central Europe, where we haven't had forces. prior to the end of the Cold War, and we still don't have any forces. So I think this is what they most object to, and that's part of this imperial residue, which over time will wane. Can we find a compromise? That depends on how much a compromise is needed by the Russians also. They ultimately need it more than we do.
Well, there's not, what's the face-saving way that Putin could compromise on that?
Well, he's talking about some written guarantees and stuff like that, and we might be able to give him that. I think they have enough scientists to know that this would not really interfere with their ability to hit us with missiles. And in a rather interesting military gathering very recently, in which Putin was inspecting the new rockets that the Russians are deploying, the principal designer of these rockets said to him publicly, I want you to know, and I have been responsible for developing these rockets for most of my life, 45 years, he says. I want you to know these are damn good rockets, and that American system that they're talking about has no chance of stopping them. And Putin simply said, thank you. I didn't want to discuss it. So there are Russians who also know that this is not something that really is designed against them, except indirectly as a political affirmation of the fact that our relationship with all of Europe is here to stay, including in the security domain.
So I want to make sure that we get enough questions from you out there, but don't hesitate to ask about other areas that I'm particularly interested in, China, the Middle East, Afghanistan, or Syria. But I'm not going to tell you what to ask, but feel free. The microphone is over here. Yes, sir, go ahead, but grab the microphone first.
Hi, Jim Moody. Indeed, would you please talk about China? We hear so many contradictory things about we should try to work with them or they're a threat. I won't, you know what, each of those have stories behind them, but give us your perspective on that.
Well, I'm going to try to be briefer, but I wanted to set the setting, given in particular the sort of searching questions you were asking. I'm going to be a little more concise, and anyone who wants further development, please. Look, we've never been in a situation like this before. Historically, in the struggle for supremacy, when two major powers rose, they always ended up fighting against each other. I once debated John Mearsheimer, who's a brilliant political scientist, about it, and he said, in political science theory categorically states if two powers rise, they'll fight against each other. And I said, well, that may be so, but you know, what is political science theory? If we and the Chinese don't fight, the theory will have to be redone. And that's all there's to it. So let's look at the merits of the case. I think we know two things. One, if we fight, we'll destroy each other. Two, if we get into a really serious antagonism, we'll damage each other. Three, we also know that other problems are now looming on the global scale that will threaten all of us if they're not addressed on a more collective basis. So there are a lot of reasons why we and the Chinese could be and should be intelligent about the relationship. And that means that neither of us ought to push the envelope too far or demonize the other. We have to be very careful about that because that's infectious and that's dynamic. I wish that our so-called pivot to the Far East had not been coupled with hints that it has a military dimension. Because why start this greater emphasis on Asia by emphasizing military deployments? Especially since we have been in Asia and are in Asia for the last, 70 years? In Korea and in the Philippines and particularly in Japan. So I think we and the Chinese have a chance, as well as a challenge, to work at this relationship and see if we can manage it.